Hello, everybody, and welcome to our first ever webinar from the Vertical Flight Society East New England chapter. My name's Harry Nahatis. I'm the president of the local chapter, and we're going to do a little experiment today, so I appreciate everybody being part of that. And we're going to have a panel discussion really centered around the impact of COVID-19 to rotorcraft operations. And I think you'll be quite interested in today's presentation. We've got the different perspectives on the impact. So we've got the impact of an end user. We've got the impact of a helicopter operator. We've got a military impact, and then lastly, we've got the impact of emergency medical services operator. So quite interesting panel today. Before I get started, just say a few things. Number one, in the attachments in the webinar, you'll find a membership application for Vertical Flight Society. So we always like to encourage anybody who's not a member to attend. Typically in our dinner meetings that we have monthly, we don't require people to be members, but we certainly advocate for it to build the enthusiasm in our little world, since boy, there's a lot going on right now in the rotorcraft space. And it's exciting times. So highly recommend those of you who are not members to please join. In terms of the East New England chapter, we've got elections coming up in the fall. So those of you that are in the chapter, please consider running for an office. We certainly could use some help in putting together these different events. Next, I'd just like to thank and acknowledge the Vertical Flight Society headquarters for providing the webinar software tool for us to use, and Jim Sherman in particular, who's reached out to us and really helped us figure this thing out. It's been quite easier than I think any of us expected, so this could be something that we do again in the future. I do have some help with me today. Lauren Trollinger-Wolf is kind of organizing and manning the videos and the presentation, and then Scott Hanula is going to consolidate and coordinate the Q&A session that we're going to do at the end. So thank you, Lauren and Scott, for doing that. I'd also like to thank our sponsors. And we have two sponsors for this meeting today. The first is FLIR. FLIR is a bronze sponsor for us. And FLIR, if those of you who attend our chapter meetings know, FLIR is a stalwart and always willing to sponsor our dinner meetings. And we thank FLIR tremendously. Pete Smart, especially from FLIR, who is very enthusiastic and participates in the Vertical Flight Society, all the dinner meetings that we have, and we really, really appreciate that. That helps us to offset the cost of the dinners and so forth. And then for the first time here, we've got another sponsor. Bell is sponsoring at the silver level, and so what we've got from Bell is we've got a video that we'd like to show that Bell gave us to show instead of giving a talk. They asked us to show this video. So Lauren, I'm going to ask you to switch to the video, and we can all enjoy the video for about 5 minutes, and then we'll be back and get rolling with the panel.
It's a beautiful aircraft, fast aircraft, comfortable aircraft. It is a pilot's aircraft, and above and beyond everything else, it's going to be one of the safest aircraft out there. Not because we want it to be, because it's designed to be that way.
The 525 is definitely a game changer in the industry. It's going to be something that the industry stands up and takes notice to. It's going to thrill our customers for sure.
It's a marvelous machine. It's the first clean sheet design commercial aircraft in decades. And the technology enhancements are all embedded in one machine. When you see it all together, it's incredible.
What is uncommon about 525 is we brought a group of customers in before we had a design. They were a part of even beginning to lay out what the aircraft looked like. What does the aircraft of the future need to look like for your business, for your missions and your needs? Let's start from nothing and make that happen together. And I think that's really unique for the 525.
It's the most advanced, technically advanced aircraft I've ever flown, for sure.
So easy to fly this aircraft. There's no reason why aircraft have to have a dance in order to fly a rotorcraft anymore. If you want to go up, you simply pull up on the collective and you go up. No rudder or stick is required in order to hold your position once you lift up in the air. Very simple, intuitive. It allows the pilots to concentrate on what they're doing and where they're going instead of what the environment's doing to the aircraft.
So the difference in the 525 versus legacy aircraft, hands down, ease of flying the aircraft. The control laws, the fly-by-wire, the situational awareness, it honestly will make you a lazy pilot, compared to the effort you used to have to put in to manually maintaining trim, constantly focusing on airspeed, altitude, and a cross-check. This aircraft does it all for you.
Because it's a fly-by-wire system, there's a lot of those things that are automated that the aircraft does for you and relieves the workload and the stress on the pilot, and over a long course of a mission role, that makes a big benefit. If he's going to be flying several hours, he's going to walk away much more relaxed and comfortable at the end of that day.
It is very stable and greatly alleviates the workload compared to any other helicopter I'm aware of.
Because of the fly-by-wire system, the control laws are such that we can pick the aircraft up and it's going to hold the aircraft in a very accurate position. So we can simply relax, we can take a few notes we need to, talk on the radio, do the things that we would need to do without having to really focus on where the aircraft is hovering accurately. That's going to be a big game changer when it comes to helipad takeoffs and in many other areas, actually.
So the 525 fly-by-wire system assists the pilots with both reduced workload and increased situational awareness. What that allows him to do is to concentrate more on where he's wanting to go and less on what the environment's doing to the aircraft.
Because it's so easy to fly and so stable and does exactly what you want it to do with very little input, it gives you all the time in the world as a pilot to focus on the mission management, to make radio calls and gather more information, and to make better educated decisions when dealing with unknown or dangerous conditions. So the Garmin 5000 is phenomenal. You've got way more situational awareness than I've ever had. You can display anything from the terrain to the airfields to your waypoints on the flight plan. You can easily manipulate all the data through the touchscreen pads. And then on your other screen, you've got your synthetic vision and everything you need for flight. But the good news is, because of the control laws and the fly-by-wire systems, the aircraft's essentially flying it exactly where you wanted it to be, so you can focus a lot more of your time towards the mission management and manipulating the systems to know everything you could ever want to know about the airspace environment.
It's got a lot of excessive power that we can use, but for such a large aircraft, it will turn on a dime. It's extremely responsive and agile. They've got that combination right, so powerful and very quick.
So the agility also is phenomenal. It handles like a sports car. If you put the bank in, it is instantaneous. It will hold it all day long. It will fly 30 to 60 degrees angle of bank, no problem, maintaining level altitude. It's phenomenal.
Yeah, the visibility in the 525 is unmatched. It's fantastic. The days of having a large instrument dash and everything crowded around where you can't see out correctly, those days are over. The visibility is fantastic.
It is a very luxurious ride. I mean, the ride quality is excellent. We patterned it after our best riding aircraft, and we've exceeded that benchmark. The smooth ride of the aircraft keeps the passenger comfortable over the length of the ride, and some of these flights out to oil rigs can take up to 2 hours. It's important for our passengers to arrive safe and relaxed.
I think that if somebody were to use this aircraft for an extended duty day, doing continual runs for, let's say, 10 hours, that pilot would find this to be the greatest aircraft he has ever flown.
Yeah, collectively with the built-in test on the 525 and the electronic tech manual, you can get to the heart of the problem and diagnose a particular issue very, very quickly.
In the 525, the tools that we provide and the information the aircraft itself is providing makes this about a 70% savings in maintenance time.
I do miss the 525 quite frequently when I'm flying less sophisticated aircraft.
The aircraft is there to support you. It'll do what you want it to do, when you want it to do it, how you want it to do it, without fighting.
The entire team is extremely committed that this aircraft, when introduced, will be the most successful oil and gas and commercial platform out there.
Yeah, the 525 is definitely a game changer. It's gonna thrill our customers.
Okay, great. All right, and thanks again to Flair for sponsoring, and then also Bell for sponsoring, and also that cool video. Next, I'm going to introduce our panelists for today, but I want to remind everybody, if you have a question, there's a drop-down menu on questions on your little control panel there. And so at any time during the panel discussion and presentation, if you could type in your questions, and then Scott Hanula from our local chapter is going to consolidate if that's applicable, or he'll kind of manage the question and answer session for us. And so I encourage you to ask questions. We'll save about 15 minutes at the end, hopefully, for Q&A, so don't hesitate to put in a question. Okay, so next up, I'd like to introduce the panel. So we've got a great panel today. As I mentioned at the beginning, a lot of different perspectives on what's going on in the industry with regard to COVID-19. And so we're really thrilled to have, I'll start with Tony Cramp. Tony's the VP of aircraft at Shell. And so Tony, maybe you could say a few words about yourself, and as well as Shell's operation.
Yep, thank you very much, Harry. Yeah, first of all, thank you very much to Harry and the New England chapter for the invitation tonight. It's great to be on your first webinar. Just to introduce myself, I'm a Brit, obviously, calling you from the Netherlands at the moment, where we're headquartered with Shell. My background, I was in the Royal Navy for 20 years as a Lynx pilot, undoubtedly the best helicopter in the world ever, even though possibly not powered by a GE engine at this point. But it was certainly the fastest helicopter for an awful long time. I did about 20 years in the Navy and then joined Shell in 2003, and I've been based with them. I was in Houston covering the Americas for about 4 years, so a lot of time up in your neck of the woods, and also visiting with our partners, industry partners up there. I don't know if you can go to the slides that provided, just to give a bit of a background on what Shell's input is in the aviation environment. For myself, just before we get on to that, I think as within Shell, I've been involved in a lot of the assurance and the advice we give out, also accident investigation and development of a lot of the standards that we provide and we fly by within the system. So safety management systems, flight data monitoring, two of the areas I've been actively involved in. Are the slides back there, Harry?
Yeah, Lauren, can we go to the first slide? No. There we go.
There we go. This second one, then we'll go straight to the next one, if possible.
Yeah.
So just to give you a very brief background on what air transport is in Shell, we obviously do most of our flying through our contractors, and we have contracts in over 30 different countries globally. We have about 60 contracted operators globally and fly around 65,000 hours a year. Some of that in fixed wing, the majority rotary wing. We also operate our own corporate fleet with 4 Falcon 7X that we operate from here in the Netherlands. We have our air safety functions, which is what I've been involved in through that time, based in the Netherlands, US, Singapore, Nigeria and Australia, and they provide a lot of the advice, the oversight and the support to the group. And then we also have our own in-house helicopter operation in Brunei, where we currently have 2 S-92s, 2 139s, and then a full SAR S-92 version, which are used to support the local operations there. So yes, with the end customer, we're also an aircraft operator as well, and helicopter operator. So I have quite a good industry overview. And that's me.
Very good. Thank you, Tony. Next up, we have David Belavic. David is the president and CEO of CHC Helicopters. David?
Thanks, Harry. And similarly, thanks very much for inviting CHC to represent the company today and talk a little bit about the impacts of COVID. So just briefly, myself, I'm a veteran of General Electric with 26 years operating both their aircraft engine group, their power systems group, and also oil and gas. And I'm a aerospace engineer by degree. Subsequent to GE, I came over to CHC. And a little background on CHC. The company's been in service a little over 70 years. It's one of 2 global helicopter operators. So We have operations right now in 10 different countries, and it allows us an opportunity to really see the diversity of what happens out in the field. I think an important thing to say, this bottom bullet is we pride ourselves on being a leader in safety. You know, safety in aviation, it's really an underpinning of everything that we do. So a lot of focus with respect to what happens in the cockpit and also how we service our customers. If you advance to the next page, when I talk about the business, the majority of our business is actually oil and gas transport. So we take customers from shore to offshore platforms. Typically, many of those customers are on 2-week rotations. So the guys will go out, and 2 weeks later they'll come back, and it's just a transfer of labor. Search and rescue and EMS, another important part of our business. We fly both in, I guess I should have mentioned, in Australia, in Brazil, and in the North Sea. On both the Aberdeen side and the Norway side is primarily where our operations are. We also have a lot of diversification that's actually starting to grow as we enter into wind turbine space and serving offshore wind turbines. And we also have a maintenance, repair, and overhaul facility within the company, which allows us not only to take care of our own aircraft, but also service many customers with upgrades. I think that's just a brief introduction to the company. Tony, excuse me, Harry, let me hand it back to you, and we'll go over to Luke.
Okay, great. All right, thank you. Okay, next, I'd like to introduce Luke Koladish. Luke is the Chief Warrant Officer in the New Hampshire National Guard. And Luke, can you please tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Certainly. Again, I'd just echo the thanks for being able to participate today. I've been in the New Hampshire National Guard for 19 years, the last 10 of which has been as an aviator. I have a deployment twice to Iraq, once to Afghanistan, and a few times to areas in Central America. My full-time job, Monday through Friday, is as the Aviation Safety Officer for the New Hampshire Army Aviation Support Facility, located at Concord, New Hampshire, at the municipal airport. My job on drill weekends or whenever I'm put on military orders is as an aeromedical evacuation pilot for the Charlie Company 3rd of the 238th, which is a New Hampshire National Guard HH-60 Mike Black Hawk unit. Currently, one of our units is deployed to Iraq, but normally we maintain 6 HH-60 Mikes here at the flight facility, as well as 4 UH-60 Limas for our utility lift unit. The Mikes are associated with the Medevac company. Our full-time staff here at the facility is 36 employees, 24 which are maintenance positions of one flavor or another, from QC, PC, and the mechanics on the floor. The other 11 are pilots or safety and standardization or flight operation roles here for the day-to-day activities. Our 2 primary missions here for the New Hampshire National Guard are to provide aviation support to our National Guard units in their readiness and their training as they mobilize on a deployment cycle of about 3 to 4 years. And the secondary mission that we have is domestic support for the state through the request of the governor. We have partnerships with New Hampshire Fish and Game, which is probably one of our, I'd say, our bread and butter. We do search and rescue up in the White Mountains with them. We have a long-standing relationship, training with them, flying with them, and supporting them, and filling a need for them as they lack the aviation assets for operating at the higher altitudes and a little more austere environment. We also can be utilized for state support, whether it's moving people, personnel, or equipment around during disaster relief efforts. And occasionally we also provide firefighting measures. We do train and are proficient in Bambi bucket operations. We've had we prepare every year during the fire season, and we get maybe on average only 1 or 2 calls a year to go out and support that. And that's pretty much it in a nutshell.
Okay, thank you, Luke. I forgot to mention Luke's camera shy. No, actually, he doesn't have a webcam on his computer where he's at right now, so he wasn't able to sign in there on that. Okay, last but not least is Rick Kenin. Rick is the Chief Operating Officer for Transport at Boston MedFlight. So Rick, why don't you tell a little bit about yourself and then your operation?
Thank you very much. And this is actually my second visit with the Vertical Flight Society. About 2 years ago, I did a presentation. So for some of you, it's going to be a review with an update. For some of you, it's going to be all new. So I'll cater to those who it's all new. Again, I'm Rick Kenin. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Transport for Boston MedFlight. I've been with Boston MedFlight for just about 6 years now. Prior to that, I enjoyed a 30-year career in the U.S. Coast Guard, where I started out as an operational search and rescue pilot, aviation safety officer, and then worked my way up through various leadership positions, living East Coast, West Coast, Gulf Coast, and Alaska. So a lot of different flying experience, a lot of different environments. And when it came time to retire, I said, I want to go where there's good weather, and here I am in Boston. But loving working for Boston MedFlight, a great company with a great culture. So a little bit about Boston MedFlight for those who weren't there 2 years ago. If we could go to the second slide there. Boston MedFlight is a small operator, but we are very unique in the air ambulance world. And a lot of things make us unique. The company is now 35 years old. We started 35 years ago. A consortium of Boston teaching hospitals got together and created a nonprofit air ambulance service. Less than 5% of the air ambulance services across the nation are nonprofit, and we're very proud to be a nonprofit. It really tempers the entire culture of our company, that being that we are not as concerned about reimbursement as we are about taking care of the patient, and the patient comes first for us. We started with 6 hospitals. There's now 7 hospitals in our consortium. However, we're not obligated to service those hospitals. We service all the hospitals across New England. We started with just 8 employees, 1 helicopter. We now have 160 employees, and we are our own Part 135 air operator, which again is very unique in the air ambulance world in the U.S. Majority are handled by very large contract Part 135 operators, but again, we have our own Part 135 operating certificate. We transport about 4,500 patients a year. The vast majority of those are from hospital to hospital, patients who need critical care during that transport. Critical care being a very small portion of all ambulance transports that requires the care of a nurse, physician, or a specially trained paramedic. So we transport, as we like to say, the sickest of the sick. And we do that about 4,500 times a year. Started out with just 1 helicopter. We now have grown to a company with 5 helicopters, 4 bases, 1 King Air for longer range transports, and also 7 ground ambulances. There are a lot of times when it's not necessary. The speed of the helicopter isn't required, but the level of patient care is required. So the ground ambulance makes much more efficient way to take care of the patient and transport the patient where they need to be. And all of our aircraft, all of our crews, medical crews, are qualified to operate in any of the vehicles, and the vehicles are all identical with the same equipment inside, so our crews can move from one vehicle to another and feel very much at home, and they operate in all the different vehicles, and they are essentially intensive care, mobile intensive care units that travel around New England. And as I started out by saying, we are a nonprofit, and therefore our care is our intent is patient-centric care. We're agnostic as to where the patient is going or who transports the patient, as long as the patient gets the best care necessary and gets to where they need to go as quickly as possible. So that's Boston MedFlight.
Okay, great. Thank you, Rick. All right, so now into the first question, which is essentially the title of the panel discussion, which is, and I'm going to ask Tony to answer first. And the question is, how has COVID-19 impacted your rotorcraft operations? And in whatever dimensions you care to highlight, you're more than welcome. You could spend a few minutes maybe giving us some examples.
Sure. I think the biggest characteristic, I would say, of the impact of it has been an amazing demonstration of resilience and flexibility by our contracted operators, of which we have Dave here as a great example, and one of the operators that led the pack on this. If we look at how Shell's approached this, it's with 3 words: care, continuity, and cash. Have been the ways that we've addressed the COVID-19 response. If I look at the first 2, care, obviously for our staff, the people working for us and the contractors, and then continuity in terms of maintaining that business continuity. And I think in that sense, we've seen surprisingly little impact on the service we've had, because there's been an amazing response from our helicopter operators and the providers to get over the challenges that have been placed. In the very early days, there was obviously anxiety from the staff who are traveling. There's anxiety from us as a company to make sure that we could both keep our people offshore safely and transport them to and from work safely without adding to that risk. And there was a lot of movement, discussion, and some great collaboration, really. We work not only with companies such as CHC as our direct contract partners, but also with the other oil and gas companies and with industry bodies, the IOGP, which is the International Oil and Gas Producers. We have an aviation committee within that, with organizations like Heli Offshore. And it was great to see we all got together. A lot of the best practice was shared between the companies, which meant that we were trying to do the same thing in the same regions and the same areas. And that was fantastic to see. And I think got us through those initial couple of weeks relatively well. And as I say, the impact on our own operations and the ability for us to maintain our business continuity on offshore platforms in particular was pretty well handled. And in many respects, they didn't miss a beat. A lot of the platforms did reduce their manning initially, not everywhere. So that resulted in less demand, which I think perhaps helps maintain it. But we were concerned about supply chain impacts, the availability of pilots, and I'm sure Dave will speak to that in a moment, but also the ability of the OEMs to keep supporting the aircraft. And again, we've been really fantastically reassured by the level of support and the consistency that the industry's been able to maintain through that. I think the other one that's coming now, though, having got through that initial period and overcome the challenges that COVID has, and we haven't done that completely. If you go to places that are just experiencing the worst of it now, like Brazil, they're really starting to feel it. You're getting a lot of cases, confirmed cases offshore. In some cases with some oil and gas companies, they're shutting down whole rigs or whole vessels because they have so many cases offshore, but that's not the case with our own. We've been able to keep operating. We're now getting into the cash preservation, so the third element, which is cash. So just as with every other business, we're impacted financially. Energy demand has dried up. The oil and gas prices have dropped, and therefore our income as an industry has reduced. So we're having to look very closely at cash preservation, and that's the phase we're in at the moment, having those tough discussions about how we maintain the business, but also save cash wherever we can for what could be a long haul before we get out of this and back to any sort of normal operations. So I think that's probably a summary of how we've felt it over the first few weeks.
Great, thank you very much, Tony. So I'll invite David to say a few words on how COVID-19 has impacted your rotorcraft operations.
Sure. As an operator, with about 100 aircraft around the globe, I wanted to flash this slide up for you all just to give you a flavor for what the world looks like and how it changed. We've operated about 200 dedicated COVID flights. So if I were to share with you mostly the oil and gas business, transporting over 100,000 passengers back and forth offshore, we had to, as an industry, understand what does it mean to be identified as a COVID concern. Do you have symptoms, or are you asymptomatic, or has it actually been confirmed that you have the virus? So as we go around the globe, we've so far transported about 700 passengers that fell into one of those categories. And it quickly became evident, if I walked you around the North Sea is where things really started first, obviously in Europe. Quickly, they had to organize themselves and understand, try to get some rules of engagement, if you will. If you go down to Australia, the truth of the matter is we haven't had a single COVID transport flight in Australia. And I think in many respects, that's because of how the they responded to the concern in Australia. And like Tony mentioned, Brazil is the next big concern for us. It's really almost a tinderbox if you see what's going on within the news. I think they were slow to respond, and as a result, we're now seeing a lot of activity. So when it comes to moving those 700 passengers, you know, it was evidence that the importance of aircraft, helicopters was critical. And the strategy was really simple. It was take care of our crews and our engineers, because without them, we had nothing to fly. And then subsequent to that, it became important to establish, you know, procedures for how to cleanse the aircraft post-flight. What do you do with passengers? And really kind of an atmosphere of how do you get people comfortable with offshore travel, given there's a disease that you don't know anything about. And that's what allowed us to, down below here in this photograph, this is in Norway, where we had to quickly respond with potentially what are ways to transport passengers who actually have the virus and not expose, you know, the crew and everybody associated with that. So our response had to really kind of be every day. It was a new challenge, I think, is the best thing I can say to you. You know, Tony talked about supply chain. There was one morning where we woke up and we had a supplier who is part of Boeing, and we all know what Boeing's going through, and they simply called us up and said, hey, we can't deliver about 500 lines of orders you've asked us for because, you know, our inventory's run out. So the supply chain, while it began strong, it got challenged with borders closing down. We couldn't move parts. But let me just summarize that, you know, the availability of personnel to support these flights, I was really impressed. You know, the folks who are in this business, they're in it because they enjoy it, and they feel a sense of, I think, empowerment to help others when they need help. So we had a good example. Some of our pilots in Australia would commute, and as you would travel, you'd be in order to meet the regulations, you'd have to sequester yourself for 14 days when you went home. So they said, hey, we'll go move to the base and we'll stay there for 3 months as opposed to traveling back and forth. So there were a lot of examples I could share with you where the call to action of our employees was really, I think, above all expectations. And I think it's still, I would summarize, it still remains a daily challenge with things that are happening. And right now, the Latin America challenge that we have in front of us is one it's just emerging day by day.
Yeah. Okay, great. All right. Thank you, David. Now I'd like to invite Luke to say a few words on how the virus has impacted the Army National Guard.
Thank you, Harry. So I'll speak specifically to our aviation operations. In a word, probably readiness, or more specifically, maintaining it while operating in accordance with federal and state guidelines. I think like most businesses here locally, the plan was to implement as much of a telework process as possible, but given the nature of our job, presented a few challenges. The first step we took was, you know, in canceling all, minimizing all non-essential flights. And when I say non-essential flights, it's probably easier to explain what we would consider an essential flight. You know, our primary focus was to continue our flight progression and our training on new pilots and aircrew members that are back from flight school and their career progression, while maintaining, you know, as a secondary priority, maintaining currency in all modes of flight, as well as specifically our mission tasks to make sure that we were available for our normal mission profile that we provide here for the state. Continuation training and just building flight time was drastically reduced to kind of reduce the footprint that we had to have for maintenance and bringing people together and having people here. So that allowed us to kind of operate on a skeleton crew at the flight facility, where we were able to, you know, designate people to be here to cover down on certain operations like refuel operations, maintenance operations, aviation operations, the coordination of bringing flights together. And essentially, if you weren't on the flight schedule and if you weren't scheduled to be one of those people to be here to maintain availability, then the idea was that you were working off-site at home as much as possible. And to a certain extent, I think Proficiency would be a big concern from a safety standpoint. How proficient can you maintain in some of our hard emission sets when you're flying the minimum hours you need to? In some cases, we've had to go to waivers from the Army Aviation Center for semi-annual and annual requirements, more specifically simulators. With simulators being closed or simulation requirements, we've had to have waive. For the actual flying piece of it, I mean, in the Army, we're very structured about what we can and can't do in the cockpit, what we can and can't carry with us and have on us. So probably about the fastest that I've seen an amendment to our 95.1 is our Army regulation that governs, the Bible of what we can and can't do. That was amended pretty quickly with guidance out of Fort Rucker that authorized aircrew members to fly with face coverings in accordance with the Department of Defense guidance that basically stated if you can't maintain 6 feet of separation, you're required to wear a face covering. So obviously in the cockpit and the aircrew, we can't do that. So they provided us 3 options, and we have a face shield that attaches the helmet that integrates with the ICS, the mic boom situation that allows us to pretty much operate unencumbered in aircrew coordination. The face shields are designed for austere environments like snow and dust, but also work as a protective measure in this situation. Secondarily, and that's what we've utilized. I mean, there was a wiggle room and allowances for using flame retardant masks that are issued by the Army, as well as, worst case scenario, using a covering, a cloth covering manufactured. As far as the maintenance side of the house, we've been able to provide all our maintainers with N95 masks, as well as getting them fit tested and into a respirator program. When they operate or doing maintenance individually, they're not required to wear it, but if they're operating on a project that requires, more than one to be within that social distancing measures, they wear the appropriate PPE. As of yet, we've had anyone test positive here on the Army National Guard side of the house as far as the aviation operations. We do a medical screening process at the doors, employees come in and out. We've reduced, we have our part-time soldiers that work in the aircrew program so we have a flight surgeon who's a doctor in an ICU at Lawrence Hospital, and he's obviously been very busy and immersed in that. So he's been excused from his flight crew duties while he continues to do that, his full-time job, and we'll address any waivers we need to when he comes back, as well as some of our medics who are full-time EMTs and whatnot, both so they can focus on their full-time job and response, but as well as to reduce the exposure level for our people here. With the aviation assets being overseas right now, we have additional space in our hangars that we've utilized as on a higher state level for the New Hampshire National Guard. We've been doing a lot of distribution of PPE and equipment throughout the state to other agencies and hospitals. We're really set up to handle that as an Army asset. I mean, we're very familiar with doing large scale operations distro and across any job. So we've been helping the state with that and handling, and we have a warehouse distro set up in one of our hangars, which has brought in a whole new set of challenges from a safety perspective. They are utilizing part of the ramp. So we have aircraft running on a ramp. We have vehicles that aren't trained to operate on a ramp coming on and off the ramp. So we've had to take steps to mitigate the risk there, as well as train non-aviation personnel on how to operate in and around aircraft, as well as the appropriate FOD measures and PPE that they're required to wear, and et cetera. So, but we did it methodically. We did it pretty clearly, and we hadn't had any incidences other than a very minor forklift incident with a hangar door. But they were, no one was injured, and it's going to be, like I said, pretty mild repairs. For the time.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. Oh, that's great, Luke. Thank you for that. I think we're going to go next to Rick from Boston MedFlight. Rick, maybe you could tell us a little bit about how COVID has changed your world.
Thank you very much. I'll talk to that slide in just a moment. First of all, the initial option of ceasing operations was not an option for us because our patients needed us. But I will tell you the overall picture has been that our aviation operations, our flight hours, our volume has dropped off dramatically. Initially, we had almost a 75% drop off in our aviation activity. The majority of the reason is, it's self-evident if you think about it, with less human activity, there's less need, there's less trauma cases, there's less need for your basic medical attention. That said, the majority of our transports are from hospital to hospital, where you have an intensive care cardiac patient or a stroke patient that needs to go to a medical center. Largely, those patients are being kept at the community hospitals because the major medical centers are inundated with COVID patients. So overall, that's what's been going on with our rotor wing volume. However, that volume is starting to tick up again. As human activity again grows, we're seeing more activity and more need for our transport services. One thing that is unique about Boston MedFlight is that we service Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard. Any COVID patients, any medical needs for those islands, the helicopter is the method to get those patients off the island. So our transport volume continues to service Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard. And as the summer comes and those populations explode out there with tourists, we expect to continue to service those, and the volume of transport needs will increase. The vast majority of our COVID patients have been transported by ground ambulance. And you say, why is that so? Well, they need the care of a critical care medical team because they're typically going from intensive care unit to intensive care unit. However, they don't necessarily need the speed of a helicopter. And we keep the helicopter reserved for those patients that need the speed of the helicopter. So far, our small operation has transported over 500 COVID patients across the Boston area. So a very high demand. These patients are probably the sickest of the sick patients we've ever seen. The ventilators, which you've heard about, are pretty much commonplace, but then the secondary illnesses that come with the COVID make them very difficult transports with a lot of different IVs, a lot of medications, a lot of different support methods necessary. What that means is that these patient transports are very lengthy. Even though it may be a short distance, the time to prepare the patient, to transfer the patient care from the hospital to our team, and then on the other end from our team to the receiving hospital is very lengthy. And the time that it takes to make sure that the contamination, that the decontamination process is complete is also lengthy. We expect 45 minutes to an hour to decontaminate a helicopter after a transport. So these transports, which typically a patient transport for us is somewhere in the neighborhood of 90 minutes to maybe 2 hours, these transports are lasting 4 hours. By the time you prepare the patient, transport the patient, transfer the patient, and then decontaminate, it's just a very lengthy process for our crews. And that lengthy process adds to the stress for the crews. At the peak of the pandemic, our nurses and paramedics, our medical crews, were transporting 12 to 15 COVID patients in a 24-hour period. And when you think about each one of those transports lasting up to 4 hours, you can see how it can burn out a crew very quickly. So we're very concerned about that stress. The complication of these very time-intensive patients, it was initially a shock for us, but we've gotten into a groove with it. And given our experience managing these critical patients, we were probably the only carrier in the area, the only airlines in the area that had the medical, the clinical expertise to transfer these patients. Now, a COVID positive patient who has acute level symptoms, perhaps hard of breathing, can typically be transported by perhaps a basic life support or advanced life support system, such as you would have as your local EMS. But if you get to a patient that's on a ventilator and has all these additional complications, that's where you have to have a critical care transport team. And that's why the month of April was actually our busiest transport month in the history of Boston MedFlight. The majority of those were on the ground side, but nonetheless, our crews were extremely busy and remain extremely busy today. So the intensity of the patients, the time requirements, and the stress that it puts on our teams has probably been the biggest takeaway for us so far in transporting COVID patients.
Wow, great. Thank you for that. That's fascinating. I have one other sort of follow-up question that I'll ask each of you to answer, and then hopefully we can jump into a few Q&A here. So the follow-up question is, what's been the biggest challenge you face in adapting to, I'll say, the new normal of the environment? Let's start again with Tony. Maybe you could give us some insight there.
I think there's two that jump out. The first one is demand and getting a handle on demand, because the operations or the scale of the operations is changing as the business model adapts. So getting a feel for that. And the other biggest problem is the fact that we operate in 30 different countries. The ban on international travel puts some real challenges on maintaining the operations, the supply chain that David talked about, and our ability to go around and maintain some oversight of those operations. So I'd say together, those two are the biggest challenges we face.
Okay, great. And David, what about you?
Well, it remains really the focus on the health and safety of our employees and our passengers. We've got an interesting dynamic with the regulators across the globe. How are they going to respond? Some of them continue in work from home, so you really can't have that face-to-face interaction that you used to have. But I think most importantly is this work from home concept has shown us that we can do things differently. And as Tony mentioned, any ongoing business is going to have cost challenges right now. Thankfully, we're not a fixed wing airline where 20,000 of 27,000 aircraft are grounded. So we still continue operations, but it's going to be different. We anticipate our flight hours to be somewhere between 20 and 30% lower year over year. And that's going to have a material impact, not only on ourselves, but I think on the whole supply chain. Everything is going to change. And as the whole supply chain starts to contract and focus on its resilience of its liquidity, decisions will be made. I think things will take longer, and we're going to have to just prepare to adjust, because I don't think there's any cavalry riding over the horizon on this one. We're going to have to figure out the analogy I'm embracing is that we're going to have to figure out how to live with COVID. It's not going away.
Yeah. Very good. Luke, you highlight one or two things maybe that you would say the biggest challenges of the new normal?
Certainly. I think the first one would be maintaining the proficiency with the reduction of our flight hours, maintaining that focus on training. The common operating picture. I think the second point I'd make is that one thing we've learned out of this whole process so far is the realization of how much information, informal flow of information is communicated through non-official correspondence. As we've had not everyone here at the same time over the last few months, things have been communicated or not communicated that have led to hiccups or challenges that we've had to face that normally we don't have because people see each other. That face-to-face communication is more important than we realized. So I think that's an appreciation we have there. And again, the proficiency, I think we've done a pretty good job, and I see us returning to a little more of the normal flight hour program in the next few months. We've already taken steps towards that.
Okay, great. And Rick?
I would say, first of all, for us, it's these are a lot of distractions in our normal operations. These are sicker patients than we normally see. The decontamination, the need for personal protective equipment are all distractions. And maintaining a positive, proactive, engaged safety culture in the middle of all these distractions has been a real challenge for us, and something we realized early on we were going to have to pay attention to. It's easy to get distracted and not pay attention to your standard operating procedures, but we've done a lot of small changes in the way we operate to make sure that we maintain that positive safety culture. Things like having the pilot step back during each transport to look at how things are going, to make sure that they can input ideas on how to do things safer and not to ignore or be complacent with the complexity of these patients. So maintaining a positive safety culture in the face of distractions. And speaking of distractions, necessity is the mother of invention. I started out saying we didn't have the option of stopping operations. So we had to come up with solutions. There was a slide up here earlier that showed some of our innovations that our crews came up with. Our helicopters don't have a filtration system. They have a very complex environmental control system. However, there was no filtration. So you run the risk of contaminating not only the crews, even though they have personal protective equipment, but the ventilation systems in the aircraft, because again, we're transporting COVID positive patients. and there's always that risk. So we came up with a process to provide HEPA filtration for our helicopters. It was amazing how quickly we received authorization from both our original equipment manufacturer, Airbus Helicopters, as well as the FAA to install filtration systems. What you see here, the pictures are some of our initial ideas of HEPA filters, and they were the FAA and our OEM were very accommodating in testing these for us and allowing us to put these in place to make sure that our crews and patients were safe. Beyond that, I saw Tony had earlier, maybe it was David, had a picture of isolation pod that they were using. It was very hard for us to find an isolation pod that we could put in our helicopters and our airplanes because frankly, they're all taken. So we approached a manufacturer in northern New Jersey who came up with a design and manufactured an isopod for us that we can use in our aircraft to further isolate the patient and control any contamination inside the aircraft. And we now have these in operation with our aircraft as well. So necessity is the mother of the invention, and our crews went over and above to invent ways to keep the patients and themselves safe through the process.
Well, that's great. Very good. Now I'd like to open it up to questions. So I'll remind everybody there's a menu on the control panel of the software, the webinar software, and you can type in your question. And my colleague Scott Hanula, Scott, if you could, do we have any questions, Scott?
I have one. I have one compliment that came in, and I have a question too. But Dave Spillman says that he enjoys this. Is a good format. Maybe we should approach this this way more often, which is great to hear from Dave. The other one is just kind of in line with the innovation that you just talked about. Are there aircraft design changes, pilot workload changes, things like that that would be coming in the industry, you think, as a result of what's happening here?
I guess we can open up to all the, maybe each one of you guys maybe weigh in on that. So why don't we start with Tony? Any thoughts on that, Tony? Oh, I think you're on mute. I think when Scott, yeah, you got to hit the.
Looks like Tony is available to talk.
Scott, when you talk, I was automatically put on mute as well.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Sorry, yeah. I've been muted by the organizer. I think in terms of design, I think the Rick had jumped on it there, the filters. I think the other ones that have come out in the oil and gas side have been with screens going up between the crews and the passengers, and enabling. Yeah, we have some fairly dense passenger seating configurations on our aircraft, and for logistical reasons, we want to try and maintain that if possible. So we've been looking at how you reduce that. The North Sea had come up with, it's not so much aircraft design, but wearing snoods has been that's now mandatory in the North Sea. So a form of face covering that provides a degree and a pretty good degree of defence for passengers sitting there. So I think it's going to be a challenge because you don't want to impact the weight of the aircraft too much. You don't want to take away its basic logistic strength. But for this one, filtration and the ability just to minimize the risk of future viruses, I think is where the focus will be.
Okay.
I'll jump in. Tony hit a lot of the points. I would say, specifically isolation from the crew versus the rear of the aircraft. I think we're going to have to figure out what does the new normal actually look like, and does it come down to you have to have dedicated aircraft, or like Rick talked about with these isopods where you can really control the environment. But I think the bigger challenge is going to be what we all face is, this idea of social distancing is good, but that's a little tricky to do inside a contained aircraft.
Right. Luke, any thoughts on innovation?
Our Medevac platform isn't as specialized as, say, Boston MedFlight. I think it's designed to deal with, a few moments of life-saving measures across a pretty wide spectrum also in an operating environment that varies. I don't see any specific changes coming down. I'd echo the same thought process that if the National Guard or the Army saw a need for a specialized platform to deal with specifically a situation like this, that they may field changes to an aircraft. But at this point, I can't really see anything changing the way we do business here in New Hampshire as far as the industry or as far as the actual aircraft itself. I think it's going to stay the way it is.
Okay, great. And Rick, any last thoughts on that in addition to what you had mentioned?
Well, the filtration obviously is one thing that I know manufacturers are looking at now. The other one that's peculiar, well, perhaps not so peculiar to the air ambulance world, is decontamination. I mentioned how long it takes to decontaminate the aircraft because we're doing surface decontamination with alcohol or other chemicals. Aerosolized decontamination systems are very common in the ground ambulance world. However, none of the OEMs have approved aerosolized decontamination systems for aircraft because of the impacts they have or potentially have on avionics systems. So research and development on aerosolized decontamination systems that will kind of like a bug bomb that you put off in the aircraft that kills all those contaminants and makes for a very rapid decontamination.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Scott, any other questions?
Yeah, we have a fair amount more questions. I'm going to combine two of them into one question, and really it is, this is really probably going to impact your cost to some degree. And along with that, have you seen any silver linings along the ideas of things that you've been able to streamline to make standard work?
Anyone want to take that? We don't have too much time left, so if anybody wants to have a particular example of that, that'd be great.
I'll say not yet.
Yeah. I'd say the silver linings comes in yet again, rotary wing demonstrating that flexibility and resilience to carry on going through. I think if I look at our industry and the way in which a lot of areas have been impacted very heavily, the way in which the rotary side has not skipped a beat, has innovated and got through it, is just a great demonstration. It's built up a lot of credibility within the industry and potentially highlights it for solutions for other areas. So I think there's certainly talk of that.
Okay, very good. Scott, you have another one?
Yeah, I think what we're looking at here is in the offshore sector, what changes are we seeing the daily and monthly flight patterns, aircraft swaps, equipment change out, that sort of thing.
David, you want to take that one?
Sure, I'll jump in first. Like I mentioned, the immediate impact is this 20 to 30% downturn in hours flown. And quite honestly, we're not predicting that to come back anytime soon. And I think the primary reason is we've got two drivers right now. We've got the impact of COVID, and then we also have the significant economic downturn with oil prices.
Yeah, I'd balance that by saying I think the oil price impact on stopping some of the activity, the exploration activity is certainly going to have an impact. But I think we're already starting to see that some of the down manning that took place is only sustainable for a couple of months, because we're effectively asking some people to quarantine for 14 days before going offshore for another 14. And we're already starting to see in places like Australia, the numbers offshore building up. So I think that side of it will pick up a bit of a recovery. But then, as Dave said, there's going to be an overall reduction, but I think it'll pick up a bit from where it is at the moment.
Okay. And
Scott, I think
yes.
I was just saying if that is a silver lining, Dave.
Yeah.
Okay. So one more question is, are any of the operators considering entering into new missions to diversify out of markets, given what's going on?
Yeah, so maybe that's appropriate for Rick and David more so than Luke and Tony, I would think, right? So Rick, do you have any thoughts on that?
The COVID has not really created any new industry new angles for us. It has clearly shown us that our ground transport program has room for expansion, and we probably need to look at that. Aside from that, I'll tell you that industry-wide for air ambulances, we're seeing a tremendous growth in the offshore wind, and that is also an area where air ambulances are required. And I know that CHC, and I saw Shell also has offshore search and rescue, but that's an area where a lot of air ambulances are looking for expansion, because we can provide, since we already operate the air ambulances on land, we can provide that service offshore as well, with additional training and perhaps some changes to our equipment.
Okay, and David, I know you're already pretty diversified, but any thoughts on that?
Yeah, more is better when it comes to diversification, and we're working through that right now. I think the reality is that the industry will change, and much like if we go back to 9/11, you know, new, I won't even call them cottage industries, but new services and new offerings came up as a result of 9/11, and I think that might be a silver lining for us if we can, you know, if we can get our heads around, okay, what does the new normal look like, and how does it adapt to the industries that we're in, specifically with Rotorcraft.
Great, very good. Okay, I think that's all the time we have. I want to thank again our panelists for great discussion, and thanks for the Q&A to our audience. Please stay tuned for, I think we'll probably do another webinar here in the next month or so. So stay tuned for a notification of that. And also, lastly, those of you that are in the chapter, we're going to have our chapter elections in the fall, so I encourage you to participate. It's a lot of fun. You get to meet a lot of fun people, and listen to a lot of cool discussion. So again, thanks everybody for tuning in, and appreciate it, and have a good day. Bye-bye.